All right, and welcome back. So, after the craziness of the 60s and the 70s, where we have pop art, conceptual art, performance, fluxus, this radical kind of critical theory of art that was going to overturn all other art, and identity art, and feminist art, and pure abstraction, it stands to reason that after all of that, we'd have a revival or two. That somebody would say, okay, let's take a look at this and let's go back to something solid or more traditional. And that's exactly what happens. And so beginning in the 60s and increasing into the 70s, we have a series of revivals of different styles. And mostly a revival of naturalism and representation. After having rejected representation and abstraction in the 50s and 60s, after having rejected the notion of the object at all in things like concept art and process art and post-minimalism, we then get a return to painting. It makes sense. Painters are painters. They got to do what they got to do. Fish got to swim. Painters got to paint. So we're going to go back, and we're going to go back to some kind of representation. But the kind of representation that we go back to is different. Naturalism is never going to go back to the kind of, gauzy, romantic naturalism of the early 19th century, or even the more kind of hard-edged naturalism, the academic style of the 19th century. That is done. It is considered passé. So what they're going to do is they're going to do a reevaluation of the human figure, a reevaluation of naturalism and representation. And it's going to take into stock all of the ideas generated by pop art, concept, etc. The first and foremost of these is photorealism, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Photorealism, sometimes called hyperrealism, sometimes called superrealism, takes its name by painting paintings, large-scale, massive paintings, directly from photographic reference. So let's be clear, these are paintings, usually painted in oil or acrylic, but they're painted at massive scale, but they're painting directly from photographic reference. That's not all itself unusual. Remember, in the late 19th century, a lot of the great masters, even people like Gérôme, were painting using photographic reference. Thomas Eakins was using photographic reference. A lot of artists, Bouguereau, were using photographic reference. But they were using photographic reference in the service of these kind of, classically subject mattered things or crazy things. Now, there's going to be an incredible faithfulness to that photographic reference. And that's, by its very nature, going to make it somewhat colder, more sterile in its kind of creation. And I think in a way you can see this as a reaction to both pop art and abstract expressionism. That is, one thing that's really interesting is when you look at the photorealists, that they often say that the subject matter meant nothing to them, that they were just going for that kind of hard-edged realism that you get in a photograph. But the truth is they do paint very similar kinds of things. They paint things that are part of pop culture, like a McDonald's stand, or they paint things like trucks. They love reflective and hard surfaces. Goings and Estes were really into shiny metallic surfaces. And all of this has a kind of detached emotional indifference. It's consumerism. So in a way, it's very similar to pop art. They are depicting things that are common in popular culture, and so it is a naturalist or realist reinterpretation of pop art, which was committed to consumerist culture. It's also a kind of reaction to abstract expressionism and hard-edge abstraction, that abstraction was like, okay, we're going to get past the figure and it's just going to be whatever the expression is. And some of these paintings, you'll see particularly when we look at some of Estes and Goings' works, that you'll see reflective surfaces that are so meticulous that, but again, reflective surfaces are weird because they give different reflections and they distort images. They almost look abstract, that you lose the sense that you're looking at an actual object at all, and it becomes about composition and form and not about the actual object. And so for a lot of these reasons, it really is a kind of realistic reaction to both pop art, but also abstraction. Some of the greats that we're going to be talking about are going to be Estes, Goings, Audrey Flack. These are people who typically dealt in environments and objects. And then we have people like, who do portraits and etc. Hyperrealism or superrealism also extends into the third dimension, starts in painting, but by the time we get to the works of, say, Dwayne Hansen and certainly Ron Weck, we're going to see hyperrealism continue, and hyperrealism continues to this very day. It's had a pretty strong following ever since. So let's take a look at some of these early paintings out of the late 1960s, early 1970s. So we have people like Estes doing something like telephone booths. Now this is a classic example of what I mean by it references both pop art, but it also represents, kind of references abstract expressionism. So what it is it's a phone booth, it's a series of phone booths. Okay, do I have to explain what phone booths are? Maybe I do. So I forget how young some of you are out there. Once upon a time, dear children, you didn't have a phone in your pocket and you couldn't check up on the latest tweets from Cardi B instantaneously. And phones were hard lines, and if you were traveling away from home, you needed a phone booth. And that's the reason why we don't have Superman today, is because there's no phone booths anymore. But I remember phone booths, and there were banks of phone booths that existed like this. And this is a popular subject matter for Estes. He actually paints this many, many times, as you can see. So they're shiny, they're chrome, they're new, they have lots of abstract surfaces, and the reflections create abstract surfaces. I just want to point out all of these wonderful, luscious details here. I mean, if you cropped that section out right there, that could be an abstract expressionist piece. It's so beautifully abstract. So in some ways, this is a response to the monumental paintings of the abstract expressionists, in the same way that the abstract expressionists just flung the paint on and lost control of their process. By choosing to pick something so reflective and faithfully replicating it from the photo, it too, the artist loses control of the process. But also notice that we see reflections of advertisements, we have words, these are all references to popular culture. I love how we have the names of stores and advertisements reflected into it. And so again, it references popular culture. So we have this kind of fusion of pop art, abstract expressionism, and naturalism coming together. And so I love how you can see, the use of something like the diner and the telephone almost feel like, pop art touches. And then the reflective surfaces, I mean, all of these complex lights and shadows and reflections out onto the concrete. Really beautiful stuff that, in a way, just kind of become a form of abstraction, very similar to hard edge abstraction or post-painterly abstraction. You can see that again in this one, bus reflections, where we have, again, this reflection of the bus in the window. I mean, all of this coming together, all these reflective surfaces, almost makes it completely abstract. But again, the subject matter is going to be everyday life, so it references pop culture. They really, in a way, then, are kind of conceptual works. There's one thing that's really interesting about them. Do you notice that there's almost no representations of people? That when we see people, we see them from the back. Here we have a few people, but we only see them from the back. They have been kind of, marginalized in their own image. These are representations of people, but we never see a face. We never see a person or a portrait in that regard. Usually we just see things and objects, and there is a focus on the things and the objects themselves, much in the same way that we see it in pop art. So it feels very conceptual. There's kind of an emotional detachment to it. And this is a case where the technique and the subject matter work really well together, because the subject matter is things. The subject matter is reality. And this hard-edge realism, this meticulous level of painting on this scale, mixed with the fact that there's no people in any of these shots, the kind of depersonalized, inhumane kind of environment, really works together, because the technique is very reductive and it reduces the human element. I mean, if you're painting something from a photograph, you have lots of technical skill, but there are no choices to make. The choices have already been made in the photograph. And so you can see that it's very reductive, and that's kind of an interesting message if you're removing people from it. Particularly when you look at like Ralph Goings. Ralph Goings loves to paint things that were, again, pop cultural icons, McDonald's, trucks, Airstream trailers. Ralph Goings in particular made comment that he had no interest in any of the objects that he was painting, that the subject matter was irrelevant. And Gerald Silk, my old professor, said, you know, for guys who thought that subject matter was irrelevant, they still seem to pick the same subject matter. They picked hard-edge reflective surfaces. In part, that's them just showing off. I mean, you know, it's much harder to paint a photorealistic painting like this than if something that doesn't have these hard and reflective surfaces. It's really technically challenging. I think that a lot of these artists were tired of the conceptual stuff and the abstract stuff because they didn't feel like it was technically challenging enough. There had been a degradation in the concept of craft and the value of craft, and so they wanted to kind of evaluate craft. But they do it in such a bizarre way. And this is my thing with photorealism, is that, you know, you can go on YouTube. There's many dozens of YouTube pages where people are, or Instagram, where people are painting photorealistically. They draw a fork and they put a real fork down to it, and you can't tell which one is the real fork or the fake fork. It's really impressive. And that's kind of a gimmick. It's kind of like, wowee, it's like a magic trick. Wow, they can really do this. They can really pull off this incredible, you know, technical bravura performance. But at the same time, it's really cold because there's no choices. You know, you make it look like that. I've actually done some of this. I haven't done it lately. I'm very rusty. But the thing about photorealism is that once you do it, it's like, yeah, okay, it's done. It's technically accurate and demanding, but if you practice and work really hard, any competent artist can do it. And it takes some of the joy out of it. I think that's part of the message of these paintings, that it takes something which is a kind of beautiful scene, it elevates craft, but by elevating the craft to the nth level, it actually devalues craft, if that makes sense. And that's a common characteristic you see in a lot of naturalism, is that naturalism in the 19th century and the early 20th century was about elevating the figure, elevating the subject matter, giving it life and vitality, and this is about draining it away. And you'll see this when we get to some other naturalistic paintings. Here's another example, Ralph Goings, Ralph's Diner. Notice again, all the reflective surfaces, all the beautiful detail. Can't see a brushstroke to save your life. There's no expression at all. It is all just hard-edged and beautiful, but also very cold, and everyone faces away from you or you can't see their face. It's very depersonalizing. My favorite, and I think the most underrated of all the photorealist painters, would be Audrey Flack. Audrey Flack would paint these assemblages, and in a way, these feel very much like pop art assemblages or neo-Dadaist collages, but they're not. They are not collages. They are collages made by her, but through this meticulous oil and acrylic painting. So here we have an assemblage of objects, a little kind of compact with photos, lip balms, a chess piece, which is of course the Queen, oranges, and of course the Queen of Hearts, the card. And all of these things in the rose, etc., reference ideas of femininity and ideas of, lusciousness, things like the fruits, the lusciousness of the fruits and the rose, and, desirability. And so it has that pop art kind of sensibility of giving you consumer-like objects, but being rendered out into this photorealistic quality, again, it renders it kind of impersonal and cold. So you can see these kind of references. These are all symbols, and they deal in semiotics. Semiotics is the language of symbols. Okay. Here's a mini rant here for you. So if you've ever read Dan Brown's Leonardo da Vinci Code series and all of that, Robert Langdon is his protagonist. He is a professor of symbolology. Oh, gosh. There's no such thing as symbolology. The field is semiotics. That's what it's called. So Dan Brown just invents these things out of whole cloth, either because, and I really hate it when he does it, because he's either too stupid to know that's not the name for that discipline. Or he thinks his audience is too stupid to know that's the name. So one way or the other, either he doesn't know, or he thinks his audience is too dumb to know what to figure out what semiotics is. So he gives them a stupid, dumbed down term. Okay, rant over. Let's get back to Audrey Flack. Audrey Flack is too good to be sullied with the name of Dan Brown. I've just lost all my Dan Brown fans on YouTube. Sorry. Look, I mean, he's a fine writer. I mean, I don't have any problem with him as a writer. My problem is that art historically, it's bad. Oh gosh, it's so bad. It's so awful. And everybody wants you to read it because you're an art historian, and you're like, oh my gosh, stop. It's like reading a book about, something like the 29 Yankees, and they put Wayne Gretzky and Mario Andretti in that team, and they talk about touchdowns and icing when it's completely different. It's just so off the beam. Okay. I'm calm. I've calmed down. Okay, so what I love about this painting is, again, it deals in symbols, semiotics. That's classic pop culture trope, classic pop art. We deal in symbols to create, these feelings of ambiguity. It both endorses but doesn't endorse. So you can see the similarities to pop art. You can see it also. She does a whole series of what she called vanitas series. Vanitas are emblems from Renaissance and earlier art. A vanitas image is an image that emphasizes the passing nature of life. We sometimes call these memento mores, the idea that you remember that you will die. And so here you have a skull. Skull is the classic vanitas image. It recognizes that you will die. Vanitas images are very common, and skulls are very common in Renaissance paintings, particularly in religious themes, to let people know they will die. All life is fleeting and passing. Adding to that, we have, of course, the hourglass. We have lipstick and mirrors, because there's emblems of human vanity, that, all of our appearance. We have dice, there's emblems of chance, calendars, images of passing time. And then also I love the tarot card, which is the Wheel of Fortune, that everything, changes. So all of these things together, again, come up to create a symbol, but at the same time, they also are very, very luscious and very beautiful. It's one of these things where the detached photorealistic style, where it takes the decisions out of the hands of the artist, emphasizes the kind of semiotic nature of it. It's really quite powerful. Here's another one. This one is the Marilyn series. So again, Marilyn Monroe, huge fashion and glamour icon of the 1950s and 60s. And of course, Andy Warhol elevated her as well in his work, so it makes sense. So here we have references to her life, again, the passages of time. She had been passed away for over a decade by the time this, I guess even longer. She passed away in 1963. So again, the fleeting candle, the lipstick, the mirrors, the perfumes, the things that are passing, taking these assemblages and still lives and giving us a sense of the life that was and the life that might have been, and then also the reflection. It's really, I think, quite poignant and wonderful. Probably the most famous of all the photorealists, though, is going to be Chuck Close. So Chuck Close was another one of these painters that was interested in creating these massive, almost monumental portraits. I mean, they're the size of Easter Island heads. They're really incredible. And I love this detail because it shows that he even gets the reflections in the eye. He would do these by taking a photograph and then separating the photograph into all of its color variants and gridding out the photograph and then meticulously painting it at an incredibly small scale. Here he is painting this. Here is one of the photographs he did of himself. You can see he's gridded this out for a self-study. This thing's only about 18 by 13 inches, but the final is 107 by 83 inches, just gigantic. This is one of his earliest self-portraits. And so you can compare the photograph with the final one. There are some variations. There is a little bit of artistic license. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit, in a way, sharper. I actually think the photograph has a little bit more vitality to it than the original. I feel like an optometrist. Is this better through the one? or the two. Anyhow, I love taking a look at these then because it shows how it's really interesting how this new generation of photorealists and painters actually drain the vitality of these people and their subjects. That's part of the point. That by elevating them to such a colossal scale where you can read the pores of the figure, you're actually losing something of their humanity. That the expressive quality of either a painting or even a photograph, that the photograph has a little bit higher sense of expression than the final work does. And for the longest time, he doesn't do this anymore, but for the longest time, he refused to do portraits. And he did not regard these as portraits, even though they are technically, portraits of people that he knew. He would not do paintings of famous people, even though he was requested. He would only do portraits of people he found interesting. And so it's kind of a fascinating thing, He had these friends, and he would take portraits of them, blow their portraits up to, 8-foot high paintings, and in the midst of these 8-foot high paintings, paint you in such excruciating, unflattering detail. I mean, honestly, they look like, driver license photos from the DMV. They do not look like flattering portraits. The realism, the photorealism, the hyperrealism actually detracts from them, from people, and makes them more things, which is kind of what he was interested in doing. By the time he gets to the 1980s, he starts experimenting with process. And he realizes that, you can start constructing these massive portraits in different ways from smaller bits, that you can almost approach it with a divisionist technique. And in this way, you can see influence of people like Thoreau and etc. But the individual technique is to do things like take fingerprints, and to actually take fingerprints and overlay the fingerprints. This is a technique that's become increasingly popular. You see this kind of technique now everywhere, where somebody will take nails, and they'll just drive nails into a board, and of course the height of the nail, or the size of the nail, or the density of the nails will create the picture. Or somebody will do it with string. They'll wrap string around, and threads into where the threads overlap. There's one artist that does this with tulle. He'll take this gauzy fabric and use a heat gun to heat it up to kind of melt it to get it to stay in place to produce it. So this kind of divisionist technique isn't new. Chuck Close was a pioneer of it, and even though people have moved it into different medias, in every case it's kind of, again, a gimmick. It's look at how realistic an image I can produce by reducing it down to simple things like finger painting, me literally putting my fingerprints, that at a certain scale, those fingerprints, this very kind of meaningful personal mark, all our fingerprints are unique, disappears, and it just becomes looks something like a grainy photograph. He even started doing this with little bits of paper, taking pieces of paper and building it up, pixelizing the image. People thought at the time that he was influenced by computer images, but the truth is he was doing this late 70s, early 80s, before computer graphics were big at all. We're still in the age of 8-bit graphics, and so he was well ahead of the curve. And he says he didn't do that. He wasn't interested. He was interested again in the process. Eventually he settled into a very similar process where he would take a figure and reduce it down into grids, and each grid would then become a simple painting unto itself, a series of circles or lines or smudges that would then be filled. And looking at them up close, as you can see here, they don't appear to be anything much at all. It looks almost completely abstract. Again, showing this influence of the abstract expressionists, where you lose yourself and surrender yourself to the process. But you pull back and it begins to look like a photograph. This is a detail of this eye right here, which is really remarkable. And yet, that's enough to show you this photorealistic image. It's really kind of an incredible way of doing it. He continues to paint this way, and he's really a fascinating artist in this regard. In 1988, he felt a strange pain in his chest and collapsed. as he was on his way to some location in New York City. And he went to the Beth Israel Medical Center, and he suffered a seizure, and that left him paralyzed pretty much from the neck down. He caused this, he called this the event, and it was caused by what seemed to be a spinal artery collapse, which, cut off the oxygen to his spine and partially kind of paralyzed him from that regard. And he had limited movement in his hands from that time forward, but he continued to create and to paint in this manner. Again, by compartmentalizing it, each one, which was very, very difficult for him to paint, but he could create these gestural marks. But you back away, and you can see how these gestural marks now complete, what is, in almost an impressionistic way, a finished painting. It's really quite fascinating. So there's an interesting kind of interplay here that, we have a return to naturalism, but the naturalism is strange in that instead of elevating the figure or the person, it kind of depersonalizes them. It just becomes a springboard for later creation. I find this even more unnerving and uncanny when we start talking about hyperrealism in sculpture. Because even a painting by Chuck Close is still a painting. You can marvel at the technique. But we start having artists, particularly like Dwayne Hansen, who started doing works in fiberglass and polyester resin. And he would take life casts from actual individuals, and then he would meticulously paint these until they were very, very lifelike in their qualities. And then he would dress them in real clothing and real props. So here is his very famous tourist. Here is Supermarket Shopper. This is kind of like, people of Walmart, if you've seen the Instagram. And he would apply hair and even arm hair to get these as accurate as he possibly could, to the point where standing in front of them is an unnerving experience. Now, his early stuff in 1970, he was limited by the technology because he pretty much had only, fiberglass and polyester resin. And as you can see, it does have a rather shiny surface. So as you got closer to these things, they did appear more plastic. But his techniques improved as time went on. And you would see that he would create something that is really unnerving. In a way, this is, again, kind of like a similar response to Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. Andy Warhol started making Brillo boxes that were indistinguishable in their manufacture and their decoration from an actual manufactured Brillo box. One you could pick up on the shelf. And you have to question, what's the point now of looking at something that's so like the original that the only thing that makes it different is these happen to be, boxes in a gallery. And this has that same quality by forcing you to confront the reality of these people. And all of these people were real people. It's not like he staged these things in their entirety. Some of them are friends that he dressed up, but many were people that he encountered, and he asked them if he could take life casts from them and create these. And increasingly they became more and more like having a person in the room. And when you consider that sculpture had always been kind of, either abstract up to this point, or even a naturalistic sculpture had been, for most recent history, white marble. Something about white marble removes the personhood from it so that you can concentrate on the figure. This, of course, by picking rather mundane subjects, people like a custodial worker or tourists or an ordinary person in a shop, that removes the kind of narrative or subject from it. And because it's such a mundane subject, and because the rendering is so mundane, it gives you back this sense of presence. One of my favorite authors, Hans Belting, talks about presence and likeness. Likeness is where you make something look like something, but presence is where it feels like that thing is actually there in the room with you. And that's very different. And presence is very much an ancient idea that, those bison on the walls of Lascaux, etc., are not just meant to be representations. They're not just meant to be likenesses. They're meant to capture the presence, the kind of spirit, the anima of the original. And I think the same thing's happening here. And I think that's what it does. And by creating the presence of this person, you know, a real person, you don't think about it. We've talked about the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is this theory that as robots get closer to looking to humans, we relate to them more and more. We anthropomorphize them. We get more comfortable with them. But there comes a point where they become so realistic that it becomes unnerving, that they see there's something about them that is off. This is the uncanny valley. It's a theory that's debated and whether it's actually true or not. But, you know, you can see how creating a statue like this gives you this sense. Even when we have people like John Andrea doing the same thing with nudes, when you attach real human hair to a nude figure, if this had been covered in marble, it would have been completely completely conventional. No one would have bothered. But forcing it into this lifelike quality, placing these nudes into these lifelike spaces where, I mean, as you look at this, there is something of a mannequin quality to it. It has a little bit too much shine to it, but as you move beside it, it could honestly be a real person. And so it gives you this unnerving quality. Again, dehumanizing the figure, elevating the craft, dehumanizing the subject matter. The artist, I think, who does this better than any is Ron Mueck. And so hyperrealism continues to exist today. Ron Mueck is pretty much the champion of it. Ron Mueck has an interesting history. He started as a sculptor for Henson Associates, for Jim Henson's. And he actually sculpted Ludo from the movie Labyrinth. So you know that movie with David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly? Ludo is the monster that can call rocks. He actually sculpted that. And so he actually had a history as in practical effects for movies. And he decided to go into sculpture. And he started creating incredibly lifelike sculptures. Now, because he had a history in practical effects and special effects, he actually knew a little bit more about casting and technology than some of these other artists. So while the other artists were using things like, polyester resin and fiberglass, he went to silicone. And silicone can give you more translucence, and it more closely resembles human flesh. And so he started doing things like creating portraits of his dad, but creating it at 1/3 scale or 2/3 scale of the original, which is bizarre because as you see it, it looks like a photograph of a dead person. But as you get close to it, the scale lets you know that it's not real. He would do the same things, creating these kind of human boys. Of course, this is called Pinocchio. The joke being Pinocchio is that, hey, Pinocchio wanted to be a real boy, and so here he's creating a real boy. The sculpture very much looks like a real boy, and yet it's not a real boy. There's something off about it. Here is this miniature of this spooning couple, created in silicone and mixed media and human hair, making it incredibly lifelike. And he did these originally on smaller scales so that you could go in and, again, reducing the scale as a way of making it accessible, showing you that it's, of course, obviously not real, but creating it it's one thing that you change everything about the original, then it doesn't have the same quality. But if you keep every quality about the original, but you change one aspect of it, like the scale, it kind of umps up the creep factor. It umps up the unnerving quality of the feature. And of course, then he started doing things at monumental scales, creating figures that are absolutely gigantic, massive, gigantic things that nevertheless, because they're made out of silicone, have very, very lifelike surfaces and, have hair. And the creation of these things is laborious. You have to thread each individual hair in them. It's really incredible. And it creates an entirely different, quality. Some of his more latest work is to creating things, these gigantic masks that are all hand sculpted but so incredibly accurate that they feel unnerving. There's his Wild Man, for example, which, for all the world looks like an actual person sitting on a chair, and you might even suspect this was a photograph of a person sitting on the chair. Look at the detail in this hand, how accurate this hand is. I mean, there's no way to tell that's not a real hand. The only thing that gives this away is when you see other people in context with it, and the scale becomes obvious, and you realize this thing is much, much too large to be an actual human being, and it becomes a sculpture. So, in a way, this kind of is fascinating to me, because if you know anything about ancient sculpture, you know all ancient sculpture was painted. Sometimes, like Greco-Roman sculpture would be painted in very lifelike, lurid colors, and even have wax coatings so that they would have that same kind of translucence, and they would paint hair on them. That's quite different than the pristine white marble that we imagine when we see movies of the past. And it seems to me that in the ancient world, they were striving for something like that same thing. It's hard to think about the ancient Greeks and say that what they were striving for was a likeness that was so accurate that it gave you this uncanny sense of the presence of them, the god or the person being in the same room. And so that's what he's achieved. But again, this isn't naturalism. This isn't the heroic, idealized naturalism of the 19th century or of naturalism since the Renaissance. This is an unnerving naturalism. These aren't ideal figures by any means. They're often, rather unideal figures that exist. And we see this throughout all of naturalism. Now, hypernaturalism was a kind of peculiar strain that exists in photorealism and painting and sculpture. But naturalism itself actually comes back, and we have a whole bunch of artists, Pearlstein, Alex Cass, David Hockney, Alice Neal, Lucian Freud, that are painting paintings of the human figure. So the human figure comes back. And these are not hyperrealistic paintings. These are paintings that allow for the artist's mark. You can see a brushstroke. You can see that they're paintings. So unlike a photorealistic painting or a hyperrealistic sculpture, where the hyperrealism is just unnerving, these don't have that quality. But they still have this kind of detachment of their subjects. Philip Pearlstein is a classic example, one of these artists who started painting in a naturalistic style. Again, in the 1960s, naturalistic style is a bit of a revolution. If you wait long enough, any revival will become revolutionary. Here we have people in the height of the 60s and the craziness of the 60s doing pop art and concept art and abstraction, and you have somebody painting things like this. It was kind of a breath of fresh air, but at the same time, there's something odd about Pearlstein's paintings. While he has these wonderful interplays of color and shadow and light, you notice that we never see the heads of any of these women. We never see their faces. They're never ever, laying on a divan with, some drapery underneath it and some Orientalist painting the way that some, like a Michetti or a Ingres would have done in an earlier age. They're not kind of ennobling portraits. They're really rather plain. They're really rather mechanical. Even though he doesn't have the hyperrealism of the photorealists, he still treats these figures as objects. And that's one people comment is that he had no interest in his subjects as people. He interested only in his surfaces. And you can actually see this in his later works, because by the time you get to his later works, he starts putting his nudes in the midst of random assemblages of objects and things laying down, and they're no different than the whirligigs and strange playground equipment that he inserts with them. These are all wind vanes and odd bits and bric-a-brac and knickknacks that he had in whirligigs, etc. They become completely depersonalized. There's also something tonally about his paintings, that the tonal qualities of his paintings are all flat. That even though he has this high degree of modeling, nothing really jumps out at you. I mean, the attention and detail and love that he lavishes on this propeller of this whirligig or weather vane is identical to what he does on the figure. He cares more about the figures. He does do a few commissioned portraits. This is Mr. and Mrs. Pillsbury, but people comment that he doesn't seem very interested in his subjects. They are very flat. And, it's funny because it's an interesting thing where you can have naturalism, clearly represented figures, pretty darn well represented. I mean, look at the veins and wrinkles on her hands, but they still seem flat. They still seem object-like. So in a way, maybe this is a response to abstraction or to conceptual art, that they have conceptualized the figure. The figure becomes, kind of vapid and empty. I can see the same thing with Alex Katz's works. Alex Katz takes it even further. While Pearlstein really did strive to have a high degree of modeling, reflected light, just basic craft, Alex Katz flattens out his figures to just almost cartoon-like cutouts and flat depictions without much depth until they are just purely gestural. So you see, his paintings reduce figures in a way. The same thing could be said of David Hockney. So David Hockney becomes famous later for all of his kind of explorations into the Falco-Hockney hypothesis, which is this hypothesis about how the Renaissance happens, and the Renaissance happens because of the introduction of optical devices in his theory. If you want my take on that, you got to take one of my other classes. We'll talk about that in some other time. But as a painter, David Hockney's works exhibit the same kind of flatness, this same kind of remote detachment from the figures. You almost care more about this cat and what he's looking at than the figures that are there. Percy is far more interesting than anything that's going on. The phone and the lamp and everything else are treated as objects every bit adding in weight as anything else. You can see this, and he spent most of his time in Southern California. Southern California, of course, very bright, very light. This is when Southern California comes into its own as a major player in pop art. And he mixes this kind of pop art sensibility, this mid-century modern pool, and the palm trees there have been reduced to simplistic figures. The splash there is again referencing drips all the way back to Pollock, but it becomes utterly flat, utterly lifeless. This is a portrait of an artist pool with tool figures from 1972, and again, everything becomes cold, staid. Even though you have this warm, suffusing Southern California light, everything becomes kind of remote, distant, off-putting, uncanny, unnerving in a way. So naturalism comes back in a big way, but all of the ideas of conceptual art and pop art infiltrate it, and so it's not going to be this heroic, idealized naturalism that exists. I just want to continue with Hockney as long as I've got him. Hockney has a long career and has an enormous amount of influence in many fields, but he himself, continued to experiment and eventually wound up in photography. I don't talk much about photography in this course. That's because the history of photography is covered by professors far better and far more skilled in photography than I am. We have a phenomenal photography department at UVU. So if you're looking for a photography department, check us out. It's absolutely phenomenal. And so I don't want to step on their toes. But I do have to step on their toes a little bit here, because David Hockney goes into photography, and his approach to photography is very similar to his approach to painting. That is that he objected to photography, especially this reputation that photography had, that it represented the truth. And his opinion was that, it represents the truth if you imagine that nothing ever moves. And that's true. A photograph captures a second in time, but time doesn't stop. People are moving, and people's perspectives are moving. And so when you look at his paintings, this flattening out of the perspective in his paintings, he does the same thing in these photo collages. So he would go to a location, in this case, Pear Blossom Highway 11, and in this he would look around and take photos. Then he would take those photos back and collage those photos. And so what you see is a photograph, an assemblage of photographs that give us a sense of how the figure interacts with the environment in time. That notice that, when you look down, you look straight down on the litter. So the perspective here is straight down. As we look up to the horizon, it starts to curve. Some things are closer and more vivid. Signs, symbols, trees, things that we relate to are going to have more kind of focus. So you laboriously go out to these areas and just shoot hundreds of photographs and develop them and then photo collage them together. But individual things like beer bottles and cans pop up to your attention and they get more prominent. And it really is a wonderful way of demonstrating that a painter's job is not just to paint what he sees, but to paint how you see. And this influences his later works, and he's kind of had a huge revival. He took a big chunk of the 90s and early 2000s off to go pursue this theory of the foundations of Renaissance art. But when he comes back, he's painting things that are very, very similar. They're not done with photographs. They're not these photo assemblages, but he will paint scenes that he will look at, and what he'll do is he'll paint several canvases, and then he'll turn, 30 or 40 degrees and paint the next section of a canvas. So you'll notice here that the shadows here are virtually horizontal, but as he turns, they begin to move this direction and they get sharper this direction. So it has this panoramic-like view. And you can see this is inspired from, photography again, from these panorama views. And a lot of these things that he's doing, that he's painting, are very much inspired by, kind of photographs and selfies and images taken from digital images. He was one of the first major artists to do works almost exclusively on an iPad when, they came out 10 years ago. And so that was, a kind of a person, clearly moving forward. So just going to go on the record. I totally don't believe the Falco-Hockney hypothesis, but that's a rant for another time. I've already ranted about Dan Brown. We'll leave that for another time. But as an artist, and personally as an artist, he really is an accomplished artist who's influenced a great many things. One of the other artists that moves towards naturalism in the 60s is going to be Alice Neel. I've already shown you an Alice Neel because she was one of the few people to actually get Andy Warhol to open up and take off his shirt and show his truss and the terrible scars from the shooting by Valerie Solanas. But she starts painting. Again, her stuff could never be called hyperrealistic or super realism. She definitely maintains the painter's, brush style and painterly approach. But at the same time, her figures are going to be very remote, very distant. She takes portraits of her figures and then renders them isolated. And I think this was a perfect approach for her portrait of Andy Warhol. That Andy Warhol was kind of disassociated from his body. He was the height of his fame and the factory he was going, and then he gets shot, and then he becomes a semi-recluse. And getting him to open up and pull down his truss to show this terrible scarring on his abdomen that he collapsed, or his interior abdominal wall collapsed because of this shooting, rendering him out as a figure. His hands are small, his feet are small, the lower half of his body is small. There's more emphasis placed on the scarring than perhaps his face. A kind of depersonalizing but inhuman way of rendering a human being, but appropriate to the subject matter, that kind of makes us see them perhaps as people. She did this own approach to herself in her self-portrait. Again, a painterly style, but seeing a self-portrait of a nude artist, but here holding the brush, but otherwise nude, even the exaggerated sagging breasts and abdomen, etc., all of this emphasizing, her age. There is, a kind of truthfulness to it, but also a lack of truthfulness in the sense that it doesn't capture the likeness so much as a kind of sensation. Which then brings us to Lucian Freud, who is probably the most famous of all the naturalist painters of the last 50 years. Lucian Freud had this very heavy impasto painting style. You can see it here. I have these heavy knobbly textures that he would create. And he was so involved in textures. I mean, this is a self-portrait, but he didn't look like this. His face was not this worn in 1985. He, exaggerated this using color and sometimes a kind of green undertone and a natural color to accentuate this, to create these very kind of lovely, unlovely paintings, is the way that I've heard them described. That it's a fascinating thing. When you talk about Lucian Freud, people who are painters, who understand the craft of painting, generally love his paintings. But ordinary people who are not into the details of texture and impasto and painterly qualities look at his paintings and go, what? Because they are lovely, unlovely paintings. They are usually paintings of unflattering portraits of people who are emaciated, or bodies are distended, or the quality of the flesh or their face is very unusual, but the movement of the paint is really beautiful, and the treatment of the paint is beautiful. So if you think about it, this return to naturalism for him is, again, a return to the painter's mark and the capacity of the painter to make a statement with the mark, but his subjects are largely irrelevant to him, much like Perlstein and Alex Katz and others. The subject is irrelevant. What matters is the final image, but that often creates a kind of depersonalizing image. And a lot of his figures, are really kind of ugly, but beautifully rendered. One of my favorite examples of this is the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And I love this because, he was probably the most famous British naturalist painter in his lifetime. And so the idea that the sitting queen would not be painted by the most famous British painter is just not going to happen. It's kind of interesting that generally, portraiture has its own goals. The portraiture is meant to be, especially historically and up until the 20th century, as to capture the likeness, but also to elevate the figure and magnify the figure. If you think about royal portraiture going back to the histories, even presidential portraits are meant to do that. And here's Lucian Freud, who's probably the most famous painter, and so this had to happen. But look at the scale of this thing. It's so small. It's like a postage stamp. It's the queen. Usually a queen, she would sit for a massive painting. It's kind of a fascinating thing in royal portraits that it's one of the few times where, because of the fame of the artist, that the sitter, in this case is the queen, and as I'm sure you've heard from all of the drama surrounding the court, we won't name specific individuals, but of all the drama surrounding the court, that the queen does not wait on anyone, that people wait on the queen. Just because you marry into the family doesn't mean you get out of having to curtsy and bow, because she's still the queen. And that's the right. But one of the funny things that's hilarious about this is the painter actually is an exemption to that. It's one of the cases where the queen has to wait on the painter. And so I love this painting in a way, because it is a lovely painting with all of its texture, but he's cares more about the crown than he does about her representation. Even today, and gosh, she's 20 years older today, she isn't this frumpy and wrinkled. and notice the particular kind of raw umber and green tones that he uses. It's a rather unflattering portrait, despite being a kind of beautiful painting. So it's kind of an interesting, thing that this defeats the purpose of a royal painting, but in many ways, such is the reputation of a painter. So Lucian Freud is actually, I think, the grandson of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud eventually, came to England, and so his descendants are, even though he was Austrian, are in England. And probably the most famous painting that Lucian Freud has done is Benefit's Supervisor Sleeping. So this one's a fascinating painting, painted in 1995. It's a portrait of a woman named Sue Tilley, and she was a welfare social worker. She was working at a job center, and I'm not exactly certain how he came into contact with her, but when he did, he decided he had to paint a portrait. So we have a reclining portrait that, at least in its gesture, is like the great reclining portraits of the past, these great pictures. But the woman, and I'm not, please don't accuse me of body shaming here, is not what you would call as an ideal female nude. This is someone who is very obese, and again, not trying to fat shame or body shame individuals. And in fact, that's why he chose her. He chose her because she was an interesting subject matter. He said, about her body, he said, "It's flesh without muscle, and it has developed a different kind of texture through bearing such a weight-bearing thing." My gosh, this is a human being, Freud. I mean, come on. It shows how utterly detached from the subject naturalism had become. That the subject is irrelevant. That it's about the quality of the flesh. And he would often seek out people who had, acne or facial scars or obesity or other things, or emaciation or meth addicts or whatever who had scars, because these would create interesting surfaces that he could then paint and that were suited to his very impasto painterly style. So this really shows, again, naturalism comes back in force, and it's kind of interesting. I guess I have to talk about this because when I went to art school, yes, I went to art school. I'll be perfectly honest. Many of my teachers couldn't have, painted their way out of a, paper bag. They were absolutely incompetent. I'll just be that honest about it. Not all of them. Some of them were very competent painters. But by the time I got to art school, and this would have been late 80s, naturalism had become so passé that they weren't even teaching it in art schools anymore, and basic fundamental figure drawing skills and painting skills had been completely lost. That's not an exaggeration. There were very, very few people that could teach you that. And the people who were painting that way, people like Lucian Freud and others, had no interest in the human figure. It was just like painting still life or another thing. They were interested in the texture. It had become completely dehumanized. It's one of the reasons why I kind of got out of it, because no one was actually interested in teaching me how to paint or draw. Then I went over to illustration. I never was a major in illustration. I was in the process of transitioning when I discovered art history, and I discovered, whoa, you mean there's this whole other thing where I get to talk about other people's creativity? I had no interest in anything I could create, so I went over to do art history. But I'm proud to say that that's actually completely changed. That in the 30 years, oh my gosh, I'm older than I realized. In the 30 years since that time, there's been a kind of revolution. Naturalism has come back in a huge way. And I really need to update this lecture because there's been a revolution in naturalism in the last 30 years, where painters who paint in an earnest naturalistic way, that is, they paint the human figure, but they're not, just like Lucian Freud and others, interested in the texture of the flesh or anything else, but painting in a kind of sincere and earnest way, that has come back in a big way. And now you go around programs around the country, there are many, many painters who have, people have recreated these skills. The skills really were degraded for a while. All these guys were, taught and trained in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when, they were still painting. They were still painting in a naturalistic way, but it had become so passé for so long that no one was teaching these skills anymore. But now the skills are utterly revived, and there are many, many painters who paint in a naturalistic style. And naturalism as a style, if you think about the works of Kehinde Wiley and others, has really made a return. So there's lots of naturalistic painters out there, and I really need to update this to talk about this latest generation of painters. But for most of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it's this kind of naturalism. It's this detached, dehumanizing naturalism. All right, that's... I do want to say one other thing about this painting is that for a while this painting had held the record for the most expensive painting by a living artist. It's since been surpassed many times, but it was sold for $33 million, I think, yes, in 2008 to a Russian oligarch. So, it shows how, things had changed. All right. So we will close it out there, And next time when we'll come back, we'll talk about neo-expressionism. So naturalism and representation comes back. It makes sense that there would also be a revival of some early modern ideas. So if figuration and naturalism can make a comeback, neo-expressionism, expressionism being one of the earliest modernist movements, is also going to have a big comeback as well. But we'll save all of that for the next lecture. Thanks so much. Catch you next time. Bye-bye.